When love, trust, and family collide, the choices we make can shape a child's entire life. Margaret faced deceit, manipulation, and heartbreak, yet never wavered in her determination to protect her grandson, Ethan. Every step of their journey was a test of courage, patience, and the power of love. How far would you go to safeguard the ones you care about most? Stay with us to know. A funeral full of secrets. The church was filled with heavy silence, broken only by the sound of shoes echoing across the polished floor. A sea of black surrounded Daniel's casket, where flowers rested in solemn tribute. Margaret sat in the front row, her hands trembling against her lap. She had buried her husband years ago, but nothing compared to the unbearable weight of losing her only son. Her eyes kept moving from the casket to her grandson, Ethan, who sat beside her, his small body pressed close as though clinging to her for safety. Vanessa, Daniel's widow, entered like a figure from a stage play. Her black dress was cut perfectly, her hair arranged with not a strand out of place. She dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, but Margaret noticed they were dry. To the guests, Vanessa was the picture of grief. She leaned on Margaret's shoulder every now and then, murmuring lines about how Daniel would have appreciated the turnout, but Margaret could feel there was no weight in her touch. It was a performance, carefully crafted for an audience. Margaret knew grief. She had seen people break apart. She had seen them go quiet with sorrow. She had seen real pain twist a face in ways no mirror could prepare for. Vanessa's grief was not that. Her eyes scanned the crowd constantly, lingering longer on Daniel's colleagues and the wealthier friends who had gathered. She smiled faintly when she saw the man Margaret had never met before, a tall figure in an expensive suit. He stayed close to Vanessa, speaking quietly, his presence seeming far too intimate for the setting. Margaret's focus, however, was mostly on Ethan. The boy sat silently, tears streaking his cheeks, clutching the photograph of his father in his small hands. When he whispered, "Is Dad really in there?" Margaret's heart broke all over again. She held him close and whispered that his father's body was there, but his love and spirit would always remain with him. Ethan nodded with the wisdom of a child forced to grow up too soon. Vanessa, on the other side, leaned over and told him to sit straighter because people were watching. As the service ended, mourners came forward with their stories of Daniel. They spoke of his kindness, how he had gone out of his way to help them, how he had given more than he ever received. Margaret listened to each one, storing the words for Ethan's future. Her son had lived with honor, and that truth gave her comfort. Later, in the quiet of the reception room, Daniel's attorney Patrick approached her. His eyes were red with grief, but his voice was steady. "We'll need to meet tomorrow," he said softly. Daniel left instructions. "Trust your instincts about Ethan." Margaret froze, the words pressing into her heart. She looked toward Vanessa, who was already whispering again with the suited man, her face calm and calculating. Something was wrong. Margaret could feel it. Daniel had known it too. The will reading would soon reveal why Daniel had made such careful preparations, and it would leave Vanessa furious. The will that changed everything. The next morning, Margaret arrived at Patrick's office with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The polished floor reflected her anxious steps as she tried to steady her thoughts. She wasn't the only one on edge. Vanessa had already arrived, impeccably dressed, her expression a careful mask of shock and decorum. Patrick entered, carrying the thick envelope that contained Daniel's final instructions. He gave a small, apologetic nod to both women before carefully unfolding the papers. Margaret felt her heart pound. She had known Daniel to be meticulous, always planning, always protecting, but she had no idea how far his foresight would go. Vanessa's eyes sparkled with what seemed like triumph as Patrick began to read aloud. The house, the cars, the family heirlooms, all of it was to go to Margaret. A stunned silence filled the room. Vanessa's perfectly composed face flickered for a split second, just enough for Margaret to see the sharp edge of anger beneath. You can't be serious," Vanessa said, her voice tight, almost theatrical. She quickly masked it with a cough, pretending to regain composure. "This must be a mistake." Patrick shook his head, his tone calm but firm. "It's exactly as Thomas intended." He glanced at Margaret, who swallowed hard, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. And then came the part that surprised them both. Vanessa would receive a sum of money and a lake house, but Margaret was named trustee for Ethan's education fund. Control of his future rested in her hands. Margaret felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Pride, fear, relief, they all mingled in her chest. She left Patrick's office with a small folded letter Daniel had left for her. Her fingers trembled as she held it. A simple piece of paper, yet it carried the weight of secrets and warnings she wasn't ready to confront. Later that day, Margaret found herself outside, standing in the quiet shadow of the courthouse steps, when Vanessa's phone rang. Margaret couldn't resist. From a distance, she heard Vanessa's side of the conversation. Her voice was sharp, almost vicious as she spoke to Robert. "I'll get it back. I swear I will. Nothing is over. Not until I have everything I deserve." Margaret's stomach twisted. The words confirmed what she had feared. Vanessa's interest in her son was not pure. Her composure, her polite smiles, the pretended shock, all of it was a carefully constructed mask. She realized that Thomas had known this, had planned for it, had left her a way to see through Vanessa's charm and manipulation. Clutching Daniel's letter close to her heart, Margaret felt a determination she hadn't realized she possessed. The inheritance was more than wealth. It was the key to protecting Ethan. And if Vanessa thought she could use her son to manipulate Margaret, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Margaret exhaled slowly, a quiet fire igniting within her. The calm, calculating plan that Daniel had left behind was hers to follow. And she knew, with unshakable certainty, that the coming days would reveal truths far more dangerous than any money or property could suggest. What did Daniel's hidden letter reveal that could change everything about Vanessa's motives? Daniel's final warning. That evening, the house felt heavier than usual. Margaret sat alone at the small writing desk in the corner of Daniel's study, the dim lamplight casting long shadows across the room. The envelope in her hands seemed to hum with the weight of his presence. It was Thomas's handwriting, careful, deliberate, and familiar, but the words inside held a truth that made her heart tighten. She unfolded the letter slowly, as if each crease might conceal another layer of his warning. "Margaret," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to protect our family. Trust your instincts, always, and never let Vanessa see how much you know." His words pierced her like cold steel. He had called her by the nickname he used when he was alive, a quiet reminder of their closeness. As she read on, Margaret felt a chill creeping through her. Thomas had seen patterns she had not. He described Vanessa's manipulations, her charm masking ambition, her patience hiding impatience with anyone who threatened her control. "She will try to take everything, Margaret," he had written. "Do not let her see the boundaries you will set. Protect Ethan at all costs." Margaret's fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden clarity the letter brought. Daniel had moved assets, arranged the will, and created contingencies that could safeguard her grandson's future. Every detail, every precaution had been meticulously planned to counter Vanessa's cunning. Sitting back in her chair, Margaret recalled the funeral, Vanessa's controlled composure, the whispered conversations, the urgent phone call she had overheard. Suddenly, it all made sense. Thomas had anticipated every move, foreseen every possible angle. Margaret felt a mixture of awe and sorrow. He had fought this battle before his death, leaving her the tools to continue it. Her mind wandered to Ethan, tucked in bed upstairs, unaware of the storm brewing around him. Margaret's heart ached at the thought of his innocence being manipulated, of his mother's hidden ambitions potentially overshadowing his well-being. She clenched the letter tightly. Daniel had trusted her with his son's safety. That trust now became her responsibility. Patrick's warning echoed in her mind. Trust your instincts about Ethan. It was no longer just advice. It was a mandate, a guiding principle she would have to follow every day. She knew Vanessa would begin testing boundaries soon, pressing for control, attempting to bend circumstances to her will, and Margaret had to be ready. For the first time since Daniel's death, Margaret allowed herself to feel a spark of determination. She was no longer just a grieving mother-in-law. She was the guardian of everything Daniel had left behind. She would follow his plan, keep the letter's guidance close, and confront Vanessa with patience, cunning, and unwavering resolve. The night grew quieter, the house almost eerily still. Margaret folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her robe pocket. She whispered to herself, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "I will protect you, Ethan. No matter what she does, I will keep you safe." Outside, the wind rattled the windows as if echoing the challenge that lay ahead. Margaret knew the first confrontation was coming soon. Vanessa's subtle manipulations were inevitable, and Margaret had to be ready, not just to defend her grandson, but to see the truth behind Vanessa's carefully crafted facade. The first move in that battle comes when Vanessa makes her pitch for the house. Vanessa's manipulation games. It didn't take long for Vanessa to make her first move. Margaret knew from Daniel's letter that Vanessa would test her, probing for weaknesses, looking for any opening. The first attempt came during a quiet afternoon visit. Margaret had invited her over under the pretense of wanting to discuss Ethan's schedule and schooling, but the true purpose was to see Vanessa's intentions in action. Vanessa arrived, impeccably dressed as always, carrying a faint scent of expensive perfume that seemed almost designed to disarm. She smiled warmly, but Margaret noticed the way her eyes scanned the living room, calculating as if assessing every detail she could exploit. "I thought we should talk about Ethan," Vanessa began, her voice honey smooth. "You know, about the house, about the memories. I worry about him, being surrounded by too many reminders of Dad. It might be unhealthy." Margaret nodded slowly, letting a subtle shadow of doubt linger in her expression. She knew Daniel had anticipated this tactic. He had seen how Vanessa could twist concern into leverage. Margaret allowed herself a faint smile. "I understand, Vanessa. I do want Ethan to be happy, but he also needs stability, and right now that means staying where he feels secure." Vanessa leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret. "I just think he'd be happier somewhere new. A fresh start. Don't you want him to heal?" Margaret's heart tightened. The words were carefully chosen, each one a gentle push toward giving up control. She remembered Daniel's warning, "She will try to manipulate you." And she realized this was exactly what he meant. Instead of reacting defensively, Margaret kept her tone calm, almost casual. "Of course I want him to be happy. But happiness isn't just about moving or changing houses. It's about feeling safe and loved. And right now that's what he has here." Vanessa paused, her eyes flicking toward the lake house brochure she had brought subtly tucked under her arm. Margaret caught the movement, the small evidence of the plan she had anticipated. She let a faint sigh escape her, feigning uncertainty, even as her mind raced. I suppose you're right," Vanessa said, her voice softer now, though the tension in her posture betrayed her frustration. "Maybe I'll consider your perspective. For Ethan's sake." Margaret nodded, letting the pause stretch just long enough for Vanessa to feel as though she had won a small concession. Inside, Margaret was already planning her next move. She would contact Patrick tonight, gather evidence of this subtle coercion, and be ready for when Vanessa escalated. As Vanessa left, flashing a polite smile, Margaret stood by the doorway, watching her retreating figure. She felt a mix of relief and wariness. This was only the beginning. Vanessa's charm and persuasion were powerful weapons, but Margaret had something stronger, Daniel's foresight and her own determination. The air seemed charged, heavy with unspoken tension. Margaret could feel the quiet storm brewing, the delicate balance of trust and manipulation about to tip. She knew the coming days would test her patience, her cunning, and above all, her love for Ethan. But when Vanessa escalates her scheme over dinner, her true intentions are laid bare. The Devil's Bargain. The invitation came in an elegant envelope, the kind that always suggested sophistication, control, and sometimes danger. Margaret hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside was a note in Vanessa's flowing handwriting. "Dinner tonight. Important matters to discuss. Your presence is expected." Margaret knew exactly what this meant. Vanessa wasn't coming to chat about Ethan's homework or his after-school activities. This was a calculated move, a test, a challenge. She steeled herself and accepted. Daniel's letter and Patrick's advice had prepared her for this moment, but anticipation alone could not ease the tension that tightened around her chest. The restaurant was a dimly lit, upscale place, quiet except for the low hum of conversation. Vanessa was already seated when Margaret arrived, her posture flawless, her expression carefully neutral. The moment Margaret sat, Vanessa leaned slightly forward, her voice soft, yet carrying an unmistakable edge. "Margaret," she began, "we need to talk about the house and Ethan. You understand, don't you? It's not just a home, it's about him, about what's best for him. And I want what's best." Margaret listened, nodding slowly, letting Vanessa believe she had an attentive audience. Inside, however, her mind was sharp, analyzing every word, every pause, every subtle glance. She saw through the veneer. She understood the trap being laid before her. Then Vanessa presented the document. Margaret took it with a calm, steady hand, though inside, her pulse raced. It was a proposal, carefully written to make it seem reasonable. Margaret would return the house, the cars, everything, and in exchange, she could maintain limited access to Ethan. Vanessa even hinted at moving him to Arizona with Robert, a change that would sever his ties to Margaret and isolate him from the life Daniel had carefully protected. The words on the page were venom wrapped in silk. Vanessa's intention was clear. This was not negotiation. It was coercion. She was offering Margaret a choice that was no choice at all. Margaret folded the document, keeping her voice calm. "I'll need to think about this," she said softly, letting the weight of the conversation hang in the air. Every instinct screamed at her not to agree, but she needed proof, evidence of this manipulation, just as Daniel had predicted. That night, Patrick reviewed the document in Margaret's home. He examined every clause, every line, and finally nodded, his expression grave. "Daniel prepared for this," he said. "An emergency custody protocol. He knew Vanessa would try exactly this. If she goes through with it, we can act immediately." Margaret felt a surge of quiet determination. At 65, she realized the challenge ahead was unlike anything she had faced before. It wasn't just about houses or money. It was about a child's future, about protecting Ethan from a mother who could put ambition above love. She placed the document carefully in a drawer, knowing it would serve as proof when the time came. She also knew something else. Vanessa's next move would be bolder, more dangerous. The dinner had been a warning, a prelude to the battle that was about to unfold. Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself. She could feel the storm gathering, but Daniel's foresight and her unwavering resolve were armor enough for the fight ahead. Whatever Vanessa threw at her next, Margaret would be ready. Now, Margaret must decide, at 65, can she really fight her daughter-in-law for custody of her grandson? The courtroom battle. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and nervous anticipation. Margaret walked through its tall, echoing halls, clutching her coat tightly. Patrick walked beside her, his calm presence a steadying force against the storm of anxiety that had been building for weeks. Today was the day everything Daniel had planned would finally be tested. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Vanessa sat across from Margaret, her posture perfect, her smile polite but brittle. She had dressed to impress, to convey confidence and control, but the thin quiver in her hand betrayed her tension. Margaret met her gaze calmly, unwavering. She had no illusions about this fight. Vanessa was clever, manipulative, and she would not give up easily. Judge Harrison called the court to order. The proceedings began with formalities, but it didn't take long for the battle to shift into unspoken territory, the war of intent, evidence, and strategy. Patrick presented the documents Thomas had left, detailing assets, custody arrangements, and contingency plans for exactly this kind of confrontation. Every move Vanessa had attempted to manipulate Margaret had been anticipated, every potential threat accounted for. Vanessa's attorney tried to argue that Margaret's age and lack of daily control over Ethan made her an unsuitable guardian. But Patrick countered methodically, presenting evidence of Vanessa's manipulations, missed visits, and attempts to relocate Ethan without proper arrangements. The courtroom grew silent as line after line of proof painted a picture of Vanessa, not as a loving mother, but as a woman whose priorities had often outweighed her son's needs. Margaret watched Ethan sitting quietly next to her, his small hands fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. He looked anxious but safe, unaware of how much his future rested in the careful, strategic moves of the adults around him. Margaret reached over, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. He needed to see calm, even when the world felt chaotic. When it came Vanessa's turn to speak, her voice was measured but sharp. "I only want what's best for my son," she said, her eyes flicking toward Ethan. But her words lacked conviction. Margaret could see the cracks, how her charm faltered under scrutiny, how her carefully constructed facade struggled against documented truth. Hours passed, like minutes, as the evidence mounted. Judge Harrison listened attentively, his gaze shifting from documents to faces in the room. Finally, he spoke. "Given the evidence presented, temporary custody is granted to Margaret, effective immediately. The court recognizes the child's need for stability, care, and protection, and this arrangement serves his best interest at this time." Relief flooded Margaret like a tide she had long anticipated but dared not hope for. She looked at Ethan, whose small smile mirrored her own quiet triumph. Vanessa's face fell slightly, and she realized the courtroom could not be swayed by charm or manipulation when truth and preparation were on Margaret's side. Even in that victory, Margaret knew the fight was not entirely over. Vanessa's shadow would linger, and Ethan would need patience and care to understand that love and safety sometimes come from difficult circumstances. As they left the courtroom, Margaret felt a mixture of exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. The first major battle had been won, but the war for her grandson's heart and future was far from over. But Vanessa isn't finished. Her next moves threaten to undo everything. Absolutely. Here's Chapter 7. Vanessa Walks Away, expanded to around 550 words in the same gripping, humanized style. Chapter 7. Vanessa Walks Away. Weeks passed after the courtroom victory, but Margaret knew the battle was far from over. Vanessa's presence still lingered in the edges of their lives, unpredictable and volatile. Her visits to Ethan were supervised, yet each one carried its own storm. Missed appointments, sudden outbursts, or gifts meant to sway and confuse the boy. Margaret remained calm, holding fast to the knowledge that patience and consistency were her strongest allies. Then came the unexpected call. Margaret answered the phone to hear Vanessa's voice, unusually soft, almost hesitant. "Margaret, can we meet? Just the two of us," she said. The words carried a weight that made Margaret's heart quicken with cautious curiosity. She agreed, knowing this could be a trap, a ploy, or something more. They met at a quiet cafe tucked away from prying eyes. Vanessa arrived looking different, not the sharp, controlled woman Margaret had come to expect, but worn, tense, and strangely vulnerable. Margaret studied her silently, sensing that something monumental was about to unfold. Vanessa took a deep breath, her hands clutching her purse tightly. I can't do this anymore," she began. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the composure she had shown for so long. "I thought I could balance my life, my ambitions, and Ethan. But I can't. I'm leaving. The Cayman Islands. Robert and we're starting over." Margaret felt a mix of shock and disbelief. "You're leaving? And him?" she asked softly, carefully holding back the surge of relief and anger that threatened to break through. Vanessa nodded, her eyes not meeting Margaret's. "I'm signing over full custody. Everything. He'll be safe with you. That's all I can promise. I can't be the mother he needs." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Margaret's mind raced. She had prepared for confrontation, manipulation, and coercion, but never for surrender. It was almost surreal to hear Vanessa's admission. The battle she had expected, the fight she had steeled herself for, was suddenly over. Still, Margaret's concern for Ethan's well-being remained paramount. "Are you sure this is what he needs?" she asked gently, keeping her tone calm and neutral. "He's your son." Vanessa's eyes finally met hers, filled with a mixture of resignation and relief. "I know, and I trust you'll do right by him. I can't give him what he deserves." Margaret nodded slowly, feeling a complex tide of emotions, relief, sorrow, and an odd sense of vindication. The woman who had once tried to manipulate, coerce, and challenge her had chosen freedom over motherhood. Margaret knew Ethan's healing would be gradual. He would need reassurance, stability, and love. But now, for the first time, she could provide it without constant interference. As they parted, Vanessa's figure receded, leaving Margaret with a sense of quiet triumph and responsibility. The storm had passed, but the aftermath required patience. Ethan would need time to understand that sometimes love meant sacrifice and protection, even when it came from unexpected places. Margaret returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. She would nurture, guide, and protect Ethan, honoring Daniel's foresight and trust. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but the clarity of her role brought strength she hadn't known she possessed. Yet, even in victory, Margaret must face one final test: how to help Ethan heal from a mother who chose freedom over him. A new family, a lasting promise. Years passed quietly, yet profoundly in Margaret's home. Ethan grew surrounded by warmth, stability, and the careful guidance that Daniel had trusted his mother-in-law to provide. The house that once symbolized conflict had become a sanctuary, a place filled with laughter, learning, and traditions that kept Daniel's memory alive. Margaret watched Ethan grow with a mixture of awe and tenderness. He was curious, kind-hearted, and courageous, the traits Daniel had hoped to protect and nurture. Every evening they would sit together in the garden, watering the flowers and tending the small vegetable patch. Margaret had even built a memorial corner for Daniel with his photo, a small bench, and a carved stone that read, "Protected, loved, remembered." Despite the passage of time, the memory of Vanessa's manipulations lingered. Margaret knew the pain of a mother who had chosen freedom over her child could leave lasting scars. She was patient with Ethan, answering his questions honestly without casting judgment, helping him understand that love sometimes came in different forms. It was not easy, but Margaret was determined to guide him with empathy and unwavering care. Occasionally, there were small reminders from afar, letters, checks, or distant messages from Vanessa, but they were infrequent and never intrusive. Margaret accepted them calmly, choosing to focus on the present rather than dwell on what had been lost. The real victory was not in Vanessa's absence, but in the life Ethan now had, filled with love, safety, and stability. One evening, Margaret sat by the fireplace with Daniel's final letter in her hands. She reread the words slowly, letting their meaning settle deep within her heart. Daniel had trusted her completely, and that trust had shaped the future of the child they both loved. It was a reminder of the quiet power of foresight, love, and commitment. Ethan wandered into the room, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked from the garden. "For Grandma," he said, smiling. Margaret accepted them, her eyes misting with pride. She realized that this small act, so innocent and pure, was a symbol of what mattered most: love that endured, care that remained constant, and a home where a child could flourish. The years were not without their challenges, but Margaret faced them with patience and wisdom, teaching Ethan the value of resilience, kindness, and understanding. She shared stories of Daniel, keeping his memory alive, and encouraged Ethan to dream boldly, to act with integrity, and to trust those who truly cared for him. As they stood together in the garden one golden afternoon, Margaret felt a quiet sense of completion. The battle had been hard, the journey painful, but it had led to something lasting. A family strengthened by trust, love, and the lessons of the past. Yet one question lingered in Margaret's mind, soft but persistent. Did Daniel foresee Vanessa abandoning her son, or did he simply trust that his mother would always be there when the time came? It was a question that would never fully be answered, but its mystery carried the quiet weight of everything that had been fought, endured, and ultimately won. What do you think about Margaret and Ethan's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below.